tonight. But the topic today, is kind of picking up where we've left off in this 6-part series. So we've done parts 1 through 3 in part 1. Coffee's a plant. We kind of focus on the biology of Coffea arabica, its habitat, how it expanded throughout the world. In part 2, we look at coffee farming. We look at the life cycle of the plant, and then yearly tasks producers are commonly having to do to maintain a farm and be productive. In part 3, we look at coffee processing. So all the post-harvest steps, processing, drying, milling. And today in part 4, we're kind of picking up where that leaves off. And we are looking at coffee as a greater industry, right? Coffee in terms of its commerce. So we are picking up after the coffee's been milled, and we are looking at the actual exchange of coffee, right? Exporting and importing, green buying, those kinds of things. There's a lot of directions you could go with this topic, right? It's pretty involved. There's tons of practices depending on where you are in the world in terms of how coffee is bought and sold. And so we're obviously not going to be able to get hyper specific about coffee buying, but really what we want to look at is the C market versus specialty coffee, how coffee is actually bought and sold within specialty coffee, and then a little discussion about what transparency means and what that looks like for our industry, right? So what is an industry? That's a question. An industry is a distinct group of productive enterprises, right? It's a group of businesses that produce a similar good or service, right? Pretty straightforward. In coffee, there are not only are there like many brands that are producing coffee, but there's multiple businesses that kind of help that coffee reach its end product, right? And we call that the supply chain. So the supply chain is kind of that sequence of businesses, right? And everybody within the supply chain needs to be profitable, right? In order to keep going. And this is something we talk about a lot in coffee, right? The idea that everybody has costs, everybody has challenges, everybody is located in vastly different areas of the world. So making sure value is distributed across the supply chain is something that's really important in specialty coffee. So as we're going, through these classes, that's something we're kind of trying to track here is like, what are all the tasks? What are the costs involved just with this very specific point in the coffee supply chain, right? So we've discussed farming, processing and milling, right? Lots of equipment, water, space, time, and then your actual mill, lots of equipment. It's essentially a factory, right? Today, we'll be looking more at exporting, right? So the logistics of moving coffee from the mill to the port, then shipping that coffee to import, right, to the next port city, and then getting that coffee to its final warehouse destination. And coffee gets roasted, right? And then the coffee is roasted, packaged, brewed, and served. So we're exporting and importing. That's kind of what we're focusing on today, that exchange between exporter and importer, whoever those parties might be, right? We're going to try and outline those entities in today's class. Who is selling coffee? Who is buying coffee? And how does that exchange actually work? At every exchange, right? At every exchange between parties, prices are set by the seller or they're negotiated, right? Depending on the circumstance. And every business must act in its own self-interest first to be profitable. But we are also, as an industry, trying to be vigilant and aware of the impact we are having on one another and the planet. And that's kind of where we'll talk about traceability a little bit, because coffee is grappling with big questions, right? 2024 was a volatile year. 2025 has already been far more volatile than 24. Coffee has recently hit the highest price it's ever hit on the C market, which is like great in some ways, right? It's great for many producers, but the fact that the market is that volatile means you cannot rely on that price always staying there. And so, this year might be really good, but who knows what's going to happen next year, right? So in our industry, sustainability has become just as important as like almost any other factor about coffee, right? When specialty coffee first came about, we're so focused on the cup. but sustainability, has become really important, especially because coffee is becoming more and more threatened, right? We know coffee propagated around the world because of colonialism, and in many countries, in many instances, slavery is what established coffee as a cash crop, right? Most coffee is grown in areas that would be considered underserved. The majority of smallholders' incomes sit below the world poverty line. So rightfully, we ask the questions of like, how is coffee prices set? Who sets the price? How many parties, how many middlemen are involved between the farmer and roaster, right? How can we guarantee fair compensation is being ensured back to the roaster? And then how is quality actually measured and fairly rewarded, right? These are complex questions. We can't answer them all tonight, but when we're talking about coffee as a greater industry, as a system that's been being developed for many years, these are important questions to ask. If we were going to answer these questions really simply, our kind of capitalistic answer would be it's the market to control these things, right? The market sets the price. The market allows the price to fluctuate. How is fair compensation ensured? The market, right? Whether that's the market within the industry, the people who are sourcing coffee, or the consumers themselves, right? So we're going to kind of dive into that market and look at what markets actually are. But a market, in its simplest term, is the means by which an exchange of goods and services takes place, right? It's everybody just involved with buying a product. So kind of going through that fast to this intro, I'm going to get into the meat of the class. I'm still editing this down a little bit, but the big point I like to make when we're talking about these things is we need to remember that industries, supply chains, markets, coffee is all about people, right? People are what substantiate these concepts. These are not abstract. These are not, tight-knit groups. It's all comprised of people who are working in coffee at that given moment, right? And so it's important for us when we're looking at these systems that date back a long way. It's important to question those systems, to evolve those systems, to try and reinvent them when there are problems, right? Topics of price, transparency, impact, sustainability, traceability, all these words, they're complex. They're often discussed. They're rooted in ethics because, we're talking about people's livelihoods. So coffee is people. That's the important thing to remember as we go through today's class. Every single person, every business has to be profitable. Everybody has to make decisions that help themselves first. But coffee, as we know, is built on relationships throughout the supply chain, right? One of our values as a company at Cafe Imports is to increase the quality of life for everybody involved, right? Our business decisions, we also want to include that. It must include that increasing the quality of life, right? We all want to leave the world better than when we found it. We all want to lift one another up. And so there's no perfect answer. If somebody had the answer to fix the industry, that's how we would do things, right? But we don't know exactly the best way to operate this. And so today, we're going to kind of dive into the C market, what specialty coffee is in reaction to the C market, how coffee is actually bought and sold, and what transparency is. So, big intro. The whole point so far, we need to remember that it's always about people, right? Rajesh has a question. Excuse me if I'm not pronouncing your name right. Does an investment bank like JPMC influence the price in C market? That's a great question. I am not absolutely positive on the answer at the moment, but I would imagine if an investment bank is buying C market contracts, right? They are participating in the C market. If they are buying up massive amounts of contracts or moving massive amounts of coffee, it will impact the price. I'm not even sure who JPMC is, but what would that be, like?
JP Morgan Chase.
Morgan Chase. Yeah. I would imagine they do persuade it. Not as heavily as some other factors, but if you know, if they're buying up lots
This
of
year we've
coffee
seen a
and
lot
no
of
quotas.
fluctuation, but then that's
Yeah,
mainly to the weather and, the weather events, isn't it? And
yeah,
the
ab-
supply being lesser compared to the previous years
mhm.
and the demand being more.
Yeah. I would imagine that it would absolutely affect it. Sorry, I couldn't hear you
Mhm.
too well there. If you asked a follow-up question, feel free to repeat.
Yeah, I was just trying to compare to the prices, being it's been the highest in the decade, and it was mainly attributed to the weather events, I believe, and not
Hmm.
uh, not a bullish market like where the investment banks are, putting in funds into the market and then fluctuating the price. That's not the case, isn't it?
Yeah, not exactly. I mean, coffee is, it's so weird right now because the market has also been inverted for like years. So it's just
Mhm.
kind of like hit this break point where prices bubbled, and also, Brazil's outlook played a factor into it. And uh,
Vietnam.
like everything kind of hit that tipping point
Mm.
at the exact same time. So
Mm.
yeah, yeah, and I'm personally not a trader. I'm not super active in keeping up with like every little thing that's happening with the C market, but it
Mm.
is pretty wild that the coffee hit as high of a point as it did this year. So let's and kind of like get into some of the basics of the C market. Um,
Thank you.
yeah, no problem. And please ask questions throughout. I'll do my best to answer some things and keep it going here. So, C market. What is the C market? I think when I first started in coffee, I didn't really understand exactly what the C market was, and I don't know. I maybe thought about it as like just a place, or just kind of like a platform in which you could buy coffee, right? Which it kind of is, but really it's a place for buying contracts for coffee, futures contracts, right? So the C market, it's a global standardized marketplace, and there are other coffee markets. There's the Robusta market, right? Run out of Europe. The C market is run out of New York. It originated in 1968. Um, Kind of in response to the International Coffee Agreements of 1962. In 1962, you know, import quotas and supply quotas were set. So, like, basically, producing countries were told how much they could produce, importing countries were told how much they could import, and they tried to balance supply and demand through quotas. And that didn't totally work, right? It kind of dissolved. Those agreements couldn't be held together in 1968. And so um, many producers outside of Brazil wanted a way to help differentiate their coffee. Brazil produces most of the world's coffee, right? And so the C market was established to kind of help balance this supply and demand, right? When Brazil harvests coffee, there's lots of available coffee on the market. Price tends to go down. Other producers were feeling the effect of those prices dropping. So the seed market was created so that producers, when they're harvesting at other times, they have a better chance of not being outcompeted by Brazil. And so that's why we see that the C market is so volatile, right? It goes up and down and up and down, mostly because of Brazil, and then a lot of other factors then playing into that, right? When Brazil has big harvests, um, versus Brazil having not so great harvests, right? You're going to see the market fluctuate a lot more. Ultimately, when it comes to commodity markets, people selling a product want to sell when prices are high, and buyers want to buy when prices are low, right? So, a market like this, where you're buying contracts for coffee to be delivered in the future, allows both of these parties to protect themselves, right? Suppliers or people who are selling coffee, if they feel like the market's at a high point and it's going to go down, it allows them to sell contracts of their coffee at that moment, right? And protect themselves against a low future market and vice versa. So supply and demand is ultimately what determines the market price, right? And we can go through this more and more, but the market price, well, let's back up here. Typically, when you see an increase in supply, you have less demand for that product, right? If you see a low supply of product, you'll have a lot higher demand for that product, and that is going to impact the price, right? So supply goes up, demand tends to go down, right? You have higher supply, demand goes down, the price will go down. I think the next slide actually shows this better. Here we go. So here's our supply line. The supply line increases, right? It moves to the right. Here's our new supply line. There's less demand for the product and the price decreases, right? So this is like obviously really basic. Many of us probably know this, but the market's actors, right? Buyers and sellers, and then spectators, people who are also buying contracts without the intention of ever receiving coffee, they are basically reacting to the current market situation and guessing where it's going to go. As we can see in coffee, coffee's really volatile. So it's hard to do that perfectly, right? But buyers and sellers are guessing where the market's about to go. They're taking inventory of what they have at that moment in time, and then making a decision on buying or selling contracts at that certain time. So again, every year, Brazil harvests, supply skyrockets, demand tends to go down, price tends to go down. We know that happens every year. But if Brazil has a bad year, it makes things even a little bit crazier, right? So what are we actually trading? We're not necessarily trading coffee at that exact moment, right? You're not going to the commodity market and buying coffee and then that coffee immediately ships. You're buying a contract for coffee. A futures contract, which is what a lot of commodity markets are based on, are basically contracts that are selling a quantity of something at a certain quality, and then that product is delivered at a time, place, and price in the future. So in coffee, the quality we're talking about is commercial washed coffee, and there's 20 different countries that qualify for this. The quantity is always in increments of 1 container or 37,500 pounds. The coffee will be delivered in one of these kind of semesters, March, May, July, September, December, to one of 8 warehouses. And the price is based on the current spot price. That price will change in the future when the coffee is actually delivered. So that is what people are trading for, right? They're trading for contracts. Sellers saying, hey, I will deliver coffee in 6 months for this price today, right? And if the supplier likes that price, they'll go ahead and secure that contract, so on and so forth. I'm not doing great at explaining this, I feel like, but and then there's spectators, right? People who are buying and selling contracts without ever receiving coffee. They're just betting on which way the market's going to go, right? Trying to turn profits off of those bets. And so all of this leads to the discovery of price. It's supposed to keep price stable, right? Or keep it within a band. But as we can see, there are plenty of other impacts that affect coffee, right? And make that price go shoot sky high like it did this year, or drop very, very low like it did, I think back to like 2019 when coffee was underneath $1 per pound. So what impacts the C price outside of supply and demand? Brazil, again. Vietnam and Colombia also produce a lot of coffee. Vietnam is behind Brazil at 17% of production. Brazil's at around 40%, and then Colombia's at 7%. So high productivity in Brazil drives prices down. And then productivity in those countries will also affect the market. Weather, right? Especially in Brazil, weather patterns, guessing what's going to happen with weather can move the market price. Geopolitics. So instability can cause a country to export or import more or less coffee, obviously. And then transport costs, right? Other costs of living. Years of economic hardship are going to affect the market. When things are really expensive, like we saw during COVID, shipping was so expensive that coffee dropped pretty heavily in price, right? Or stayed low from where it was in 2019. So lots of other impacts on price, right? The lowest we've seen, 41 cents. Highest we've seen just this past year, 440, right? The question is obviously, does the C price affect the specialty price? And yes, like obviously something being sold at 41 cents versus 440 is going to affect even the premium product. So one thing to note about the C price, this is going back to the early 70s, is that you can see over time if you adjusted for inflation. I've never seen a chart adjusted for inflation. I think that'd be cool to create, but we've been paying pretty much less and less and less for coffee over the years, right? Specialty coffee kind of being a reaction to the C market. I think a big part of specialty is obviously paying more for coffee, right? But we've been paying less and less and less. And many of us have heard probably that, 41 cents a pound, obviously, even at this time. But like I said, in 2019, when coffee was underneath $1 per pound, that's not enough for a producer to actually make money on the amount of coffee they're producing, right? And so what is specialty coffee? Depends who you ask. How do you define it? But specialty coffee is kind of a reaction to this market, right? A market that calls all coffee the same. It is just trading for contracts without any more traceability than that, right? So I don't feel like I did a great job of explaining the C market there, but if we have any questions, please ask any questions. Maybe that'll help me do a little bit better, but it's a place for trading contracts for coffee, right? And that coffee will eventually be delivered when that contract expires. But that is essentially the C market, right? Okay, there's no questions. We can keep going here. So let's see, what is specialty coffee then? It's almost easier to say what specialty coffee isn't, right? Or contrasting it to the C market. It is not a standardized marketplace, right? Nobody controls specialty coffee. There's no governing body. There is no market where all transaction information is being uploaded like the C market. It is not a contract-based marketplace, right? And it doesn't call all coffee the same. We've seen definitions for specialty coffee come and go. The most recent kind of definitions, we've been talking about are recognizing its qualities, right? Its distinctness, both in the cup or outside of the cup. It's about recognizing who actually produced it, right? It's about recognizing how it was processed and how unique that cup is compared to every other cup, right? Every cup of coffee is unique in and of itself. So recognizing that specialness, and then focusing on the human skill and the human artisanship of every step is all kind of wrapped up in what we think of as specialty coffee, right? But ultimately, specialty coffee is people saying this thing is good and paying more money for it, essentially. The challenge has always been, defining quality. Let me go back to this real quick. The story of specialty coffee is largely an industry's kind of journey in defining what quality means, because coffee doesn't have quality inside of it, right? Coffee has sugars and acids and salts and bitter components inside of it. It doesn't have a thing called quality in it, right? So it's really our perception of these flavors imbued into the coffee by everything that it's gone before to give it its kind of standout quality, right? Compared to everything else. But there's an agreed upon almost a cultural sense of what quality means, right? So quality is the standard of something measured against other things. The easiest thing to measure specialty coffee against is against C market coffee, right? If you taste normal commodity coffee, it is very different than what you would drink going into a specialty cafe, right? The other thing is distinctive attributes or characteristics, right? The characteristics of each cup being recognized. The challenge is that quality is subjective. People like different things, right? Flavor is built on our physiology, on our biology, and our memory and our experiences. Those are all extremely personal, right? It all adds to the subjectivity of quality. Um, and measuring something that is subjective is really challenging, right? It requires very particular kinds of tests to be able to measure something. But at the same time, subjectivity isn't bad. We are all allowed to have our opinions within specialty coffee, right? As a roaster or as an importer, if we don't have an opinion, we're probably not very good at our job at the same time. We all have different tastes. We serve customers of different tastes, and we seek out coffees with those tastes, right? Quality is subjective, but we know what we like, and that's really important too. So we know specialty coffee often comes down to sweet, balanced, clean coffees, and that the more distinctive those coffees get, right, in a way that we like, they get more rewarded monetarily, right? So calibrating ourselves to what is good and then what is super distinct and above and beyond good. Again, it's been a journey for specialty coffee. Specialty coffee's changed a lot since even I've been in it, right? So before the 1900s, coffee is based purely on physical appearance, right? We're not even tasting the product. In the early 1900s, that's when we get a few people from a few importers that start tasting coffee and describing it. And it goes a long time up to 1974, where the first time specialty coffee as a term comes about. And if you've heard of Erna Knutson, then you probably know kind of her story, but she worked for an importer. Leftover bags from lots of coffee, she would cup test those, right? She would taste them, and she would sell these individual or really small amounts of coffee to small roasters, right? Based on their flavors. So this is kind of the first instance of like an importer finding lots and describing those lots to small roasters, right? So kind of the rise of the smaller roaster that we see come about in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, right? Kind of preceded all of that. The SCAA is established. Ted Lingle creates the Coffee Cuppers Handbook, which we'll come back to. The Europe chapter of Specialty Coffee Association is established. And then in 2004, we see the cupping form, right, adopted as the main way that we are tasting and grading coffee, pushed by, the education for it, pushed by CQI, backed up by the SCAA. Europe and America merge into the larger SCA body that we know today, right? But from 2004 on, until this year, we were cupping coffee off of this cupping form that Ted Lingle created. Throughout this time, we're getting lots of different definitions of specialty coffee. It's the highest quality green coffee beans roasted to their greatest flavor by true craftspeople, right? The best coffee roasted the best way by the best people and brewed perfectly, right? That's specialty coffee. And that was back, in the 90s, that definition was given. Over time, we saw the definition get a lot more specific, right? A lot more numbers, right? Trying to quantify specialty. No, 0 category 1 defects, no more than 5 category 2 defects. And on our cupping form, it scores 80 plus points. So again, quantifying quality is pretty much impossible. But specialty coffee for many years has kind of been boiled down to its score, right? This 80 to 100 point score. So again, at the end of the day, for a lot of specialty coffee, it does come down to that final cup. We were scoring fragrance, flavor, aftertaste, acidity, body, balance uniformity in cup sweetness, and our overall impression, right? So on this form, we are describing coffee, we are writing down what we are experiencing, but then we are assigning a value to that experience, right? Day in and day out, when we are tasting coffee, we're subject to the entire context that we're tasting within, right? You can taste coffee one day and score it lower than the next day, but there was no better way really to come up with like describing and scoring coffee that stood out to us, right? So it was an imperfect way of scoring coffee, but it gave us a language. And years over years over years from 2004 on, the Q grading system and this score sheet established a language of talking about coffee flavor and scoring it internationally, right? Q graders were the people who went through the training system, who really established the language and the scoring metrics. They had to take 6-day training program, pass 22-part exam to become a Q grader. And that was kind of like the gold standard. But at the same time, there's, hundreds of thousands of roasters out there who are buying coffee. The people who are really buying coffee, roasting it and selling it to their customers, who are also involved with this, right? Who also bought coffee, even though they weren't Q graders. So this just changed this year. So it's become interesting to talk about, that phase of specialty coffee. The CQI that used to certify Q graders, it's now been handed to the SCA. I'm going to skip some of these. But that 80 to 100 points, that's pretty much kind of stayed, right? Like a coffee that scores 80 plus is specialty, and that tells us how differentiated that coffee is over sub 80 coffees, right? Over C market coffees. So the biggest thing with cupping and with scoring coffees is that the brewing of the coffee needs to be absolutely consistent. The coffees should be tasted blind. We shouldn't know what the coffees are. And then we are tasting, describing, and scoring those individual aspects of the coffee to get that final score, right? And all of that is supposed to then contribute to price. The challenge with that is if the people producing coffee don't know our language, or if the people producing coffee don't know what we value, then that's not a very transparent system, right? And that's what made coffee challenging for a long time. It was the people buying coffee saying what the product was worth, not the people producing the coffee, right? And that's different than most industries. That is not how it's supposed to be, right? Where the buyer sets the price. That doesn't happen. The seller is supposed to set the price. And so another aspect of specialty coffee has been, basically leveling the playing field, right? Not only recognizing other things about coffee that we value and rewarding those things, but also allowing the entire coffee culture, right, from farm all the way to the final cup, to kind of get on the same page, understand the same things about coffee, and everybody having the tools to really have that language of communication about quality. Is R grading the same as Q grading? So R grading, Robusta grading, it's similar, but it's a totally different flavor set, a totally different scoring system adjusted to Robusta, right? And our expectations about Robusta. So it is the same in the sense that it's trying to establish a language around Robusta coffee, but it's going to look really similar, but obviously the scoring and the language around it will be different, but it's the same kind of concept. So
yeah, are we using the same SCA form for the same R grading as well?
I'm sorry, one more time.
Are we using the same SCA form for R grading as well?
No, I believe it's like a different form. I'm going to try and pull up a picture of it. And Robusta grading is actually pretty new. Like they just came up with, you know, a Robusta grading form pretty recently, I think.
Okay.
Compared to
is
Arabica coffee.
is it again a CA or is it different?
That's what I'm trying to. I can't remember.
Okay.
I know that the World Coffee Research, and then what is that lab called? There's like a sensory focused lab. They kind of developed a flavor wheel for Robusta, and then from that they've created a scoring system.
Okay.
But I'm not sure who certifies our graders. It might be SCA. I wouldn't be surprised. I would think it would be SCA, but I am not sure.
Okay.
Oh,
good.
But yeah, they do have a new flavor wheel. It came out last year. Yeah, they have their own course, but I'm not sure who certifies. So
okay,
I'll look at that. But
so yeah, so the whoever is assessing should be our grader, and it's a different. Okay.
Yeah,
makes sense. Yep. Thank you.
No problem. And then Michael, wasn't there a change? There was a change. So CQI used to certify Q graders, CQI being the Coffee Quality Institute. This year, the Specialty Coffee Association kind of took over that entire program, and they created a new cupping form. And really, it's like 3 cupping forms in one. So there's an affective tasting form, a descriptive tasting form, and then an external acting form. So the idea was like, let's kind of split out all the parts that were on the old score sheet. One form we're just describing, we're not scoring it. One form we're going in and scoring it, and they're trying to expand how many numbers you use. And then there's another form where you write down extrinsic attributes, right? It's basically the same as the old cupping form, just separated out on multiple papers. And then I guess trying to capture extrinsic attributes. With that, basically has come a whole new set of classes. Everybody who was a Q grader has to retake a new Q grader test. The industry at large is pretty divided on if they like it or not. It feels like the same thing that we previously had, just dressed up, brand new, repackaged, and now there's new classes. So it kind of feels like a money grab. But then other people really like this new form. At the end of the day, it's not really like the form that we are using that defines specialty coffee, right? It comes down to like, you know, do our customers like it? Do we like it? Do we have a relationship that allows us to buy that coffee in a way that feels fair? And, what kind of impact are we making with those purchases? Like all of those larger questions outside of just the flavor of the cup are also very, very important in specialty coffee, right? So this is, do previous scores equate to new scores? I don't really know. You would, like, if you scored a coffee the old way and a new way, I'm not sure if the scores would be the same or not. They might be the exact same. But, at the end of the day, it's almost like all of it's kind of just made up. We're just making it up. And the more challenging question is like, does the score equate to the price, right, that we're paying for it? And, not always, right? The goal with this was to like capture more information about the coffee and be able to communicate with a producer better. All of it's communication, right? When we're describing a coffee, it's communication. When we're scoring a coffee, we're communicating how we feel about it. And so, at the end of the day, like again, that score sheet doesn't really define specialty coffee. Some people will use the new SCA score sheet. Some people will stick to the old one. I know many companies that have their own way of tasting and scoring coffee. We have developed like an app for scoring coffee, where we don't score it at all. We just input what we taste, and then they're just descriptors have a pre-assigned value to it, right? So like there's a lot of different ways nowadays to kind of taste coffee. I think the important thing again is like this point about trust and good faith creates connections between producers, buyers, and consumers, right? Especially coffee is built on connections, whether you know the producer directly, or if you're going through an exporter that works with that producer, like in some way, specialty coffee is far more connected than the C market coffee. Jorge, do you have a question?
Yeah, I have probably a comment based on the previous form for coffee evaluation, even the new one as well. I'm at the end of the change. I am roaster here in Australia. We import some coffee from Colombia. I'm from Colombia. We have cafe, so we serve coffee here. But for me, the really important part on this is how do we communicate this to the farmers? Because you want to bring transparency. So the previous form, it was for some of the farmers, they even don't know what you mean with any of this, And the new format that we just came out, which is, as you say, is super confusing. It's like nobody knows anything in reality what's going on. How are you going to trade those three forms to the origin in the middle of a mountain in Colombia to someone who probably never had been even in contact with the previous one, and now you're going to show up with three papers? It's a very, it's a very tricky part to try to be transparent, and is what we are looking for now. Be transparent, bring a coffee for our consumers that they know where it comes from, and they know what the farmers are happy to sell this coffee, and not just that they're selling it because they need the money, all that kind of thing. So it will be good if the industry come together with something like really help not just the top of the industry, but the base of the industry, the farmers, all around the world.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I agree with you that the old form, it wasn't any better than this new form. In fact, the new form maybe just made the old form like a little bit worse, right? Like it didn't fix anything. Like I don't know, people thought it might fix something, but it doesn't fix transparency for sure. It does not fix it, because to be transparent, basically the person producing coffee needs to know what we like and how much we like that thing, right? We need to be able to say like lemon is a good flavor note and it's this good to us. So if you produce coffee with lemon, like that's worth a good price, right? But like that, I guess, knowing what the consumer values would make the process more transparent. And this doesn't help producers do that whatsoever. And so I agree with you. Like the biggest thing really is communication, right? Tasting coffee together and communicating what we're tasting together and why we like that is really the only way to make coffee grading transparent, right? Everybody participating in it and understanding one another. But even that's hard because we have different tastes in different parts of the world, right? But that's like at least for us at Cafe Imports, the reason we made a new cupping form where we aren't scoring is because if I'm in a good mood one day and I taste orange, I might score it high. And then the next day I wake up in a bad mood, I taste the same coffee, the same flavor of orange, but I score it low, right? There's human variance day after day after day that we're making decisions about versus like we are tasting and describing, and then there is a machine in the background that's assigning a score to that flavor note the same way day after day after day. And that's what we're trying to take to producers to show them like, hey, this kind of cup profile always scores this way. But it's hard. It's like again, it's one of those things where coffee has always been extractive, right? We are extracting this product from a place that is typically underserved, right? And that's what makes coffee challenging to make fair and transparent. I appreciate your comments on that for sure. And again, nobody makes the rules. It's not a regulated market, right? There really are no rules. So for me, like, we can talk about score sheets. We can talk about flavor. We can talk about certifications even. But ultimately, specialty coffee comes down to the fact that it's an entire culture, right? It's an entire way of thinking about a product. A culture, you know, if you think about a specific culture, that includes generationally built beliefs, values, practices, languages, symbols, and all of these things kind of shape how somebody moves throughout the world, right? And so the coffee culture, we're very much just learning from one another through osmosis, right? It's industry trends combined with long held beliefs, combined with new discoveries, combined with different tools and people all over the world, literally in every corner of the world. And all of that is coming together to kind of create the coffee industry, right? So that's the other challenge is it's a culture that's constantly changing, right? We're always changing how we think about coffee. So we want to make sure that as people, you know, the coffee culture is changing in a way that supports everybody and it doesn't continue to lift up just the consuming side, right? And that's what a lot of people worry this new scoring form does. It continues to just lift the same people that it always has and not all boats, right? So when we get into green buying, how is coffee actually bought and sold? I personally didn't when I was a barista, like understanding how green buying happened. I didn't understand how the money actually exchanged for the coffee. So if we will demystify that, if that's a mysterious process at all. And then we'll talk about different entities, right? Like who are the different groups at origin that are selling coffee, right? It's not always single farmers selling their coffee. In fact, that's probably the minority of instances, right? And all that kind of helps us get an idea of how many times a coffee is changing hands. Who is selling coffee? Who are the producing entities? We have three entities that we'll kind of group this into: producers, cooperatives, and exporters. A producer is obviously the grower and harvester of a coffee, right? We define the grower of coffee as a farmer, as somebody who grows and processes coffee as a producer. That's just kind of our internal definition at Cafe Imports. That's not like an industry-wide thing, but we do differentiate people who grow and then people who grow and process. People who grow their coffee but don't process, right? Farmers, they are going to sell their coffee first to a processor in cherry, right? So they have to sell their coffee before it's all the way in the seed form, right? They are going to sell their coffee to a processor of some sort. We'll talk about different processors. Somebody who grows and processes their own coffee is going to sell their coffee in parchment to a dry mill, somebody who operates a dry mill. And then there are some very specific cases where, like in Costa Rica, for example, where they have micro mills, right? Farmers can grow, they process, and they mill their own coffee, and then they get that coffee exported, right? So basically, producers, are making the choice on what operations they want to handle or can handle at their level. And then that determines what choices they have in terms of where and how they're going to sell that coffee. No matter what, though, the price paid back to the producer is called farm gate, right? When the coffee leaves the farm, ownership typically transfers. So that's why we call it farm gate, price paid to the producer. Farm gate needs to cover the cost of production, the cost of living, and include profit, right? There's a handful of studies out there you can actually read on cost of production and cost of living. Again, most farmers live and operate in underserved areas, in areas where the farmer has not, tracked their cost of production, right? When we're talking 20 years ago, almost no coffee producer tracked their cost of production. It was a number we didn't, as buyers, even know, right? We didn't know how much it cost to produce coffee. And so there are some studies coming out about this, which is great. These numbers vary drastically country to country. And there have been plenty of seasons where the C market price doesn't come close to even making a profit for producers, right? So largely, a lot of coffee has been an unprofitable business. Farmgate needs to include farmer profits, and that's a big point of emphasis for the people we work with, is understanding, like, as much as we can, what is a living wage in coffee, right? So producers. The next group is cooperatives or associations. This group is a local business that is collectively owned or operated by multiple farmers, right, working together. So obviously, the distinguishing factor here is it's not a single farm, it is a group of producers. Working as a group, and the reasons we see cooperatives in many areas is because as a group, that's more coffee, right? More market, greater market access. You can share knowledge against one another. And just centralizing processing or milling, centralizing the logistics of shipping that coffee. It makes it less expensive of a process. We have more bulk to work with. We've got with that, member and community benefits. So there are tons of different size cooperatives. I've seen cooperatives that have 15 producers, right? And then there's cooperatives that are like entire microregions, right? Maybe multiple towns and producers in between all of those towns, right? Some big and some small. Different co-ops might keep their coffee all separate in different microlots. Some co-ops might blend every single producer's coffee together, right? So co-ops can range in size for sure. In some instances, coffee will be purchased from producers in cherry, right? So we talked about there are producers who don't process their coffee. They may deliver it to their cooperative where that coffee will then be processed. Some co-ops don't have a way to process coffee. So instead, the producer will process it, and then the cooperative will collect that cherry or collect that coffee in parchment, right? They'll just collect the seeds, and then they'll contract a mill or a dry mill to mill that coffee. And then exporters. Exporters also sell coffee. Exporters are different because they are a company, right? They're not collectively owned necessarily. They're not a group of producers. It is an origin-based company, private or public, right? Owned by the government or just owned privately, that focuses on sourcing coffee, right? They source coffee. They may process that coffee, mill, market, and export that coffee. In some countries, like often in East Africa, about Ethiopia, producers' farm sizes are so small that all the producers in those areas are delivering their cherry to one exporter, right? For a long time, those exporters were government run. They were required to export through the government system, right? And so there are instances where exporters are always collecting cherry, and then they're blending that coffee, milling it, and bringing it all to market. There are also really small exporters that focus on quality, right? They will source microlots, and they almost act as a marketing agent for that farm, right? So they keep that coffee separate, and they find a few buyers for that farm, right? So there are very small ones, there's huge ones, but the price paid to an exporter by somebody buying their coffee is called free on board, right? Free on board, or FOB, is basically what you are paying the exporter who sourced that coffee, milled it, and then you organize the logistics with them. On board referring to the actual boat that the coffee is shipping on. the price we're paying that gets the coffee onto the boat. The FOB price, which might be truck or carrier, the exporter, once coffee is loaded onto a truck that's going to the port, that's FOT, that price needs to cover farm gate, right? Farm gate is behind it, and then all the exporters' costs and profit. So those are kind of like the three, right? You've got individual farmers, cooperative groups of farmers, and you've got exporters, which are sourcing businesses, right? Exporters. Consuming buyers, importers, roasters, and then obviously all of that trickles down to the consumer. So importers, like us, Cafe Imports, we are companies that are kind of similar to exporters, just on the opposite end of the supply chain, right? We focus on sourcing coffee, purchasing that coffee and handling all the shipping logistics, and then passing that coffee before we then get that coffee to the roaster, right? Importers, like exporters, like co-ops, they can range from super big, super small operations. They can offer a huge range of quality. The kind of, I guess, upside that importers have is they often have more capital to buy more coffee. They can a bunch of coffee together in a shipping container for more cost-effective shipping. And like an exporter or a co-op, they often provide services to roasters and or farmers, right? Social programs, purchasing payments, and flexibility options. We often finance a farmer's harvest before the harvest is started, things like that, right? The price paid to an importer is called Ex Works or Ex Warehouse. So the price paid to the importer is what gets the coffee to leave the importer's warehouse and move to the roaster. So roasters, right? They also focus on sourcing, whether that be from origin party or from an importer, then roast, package, and sell that coffee. Wholesale or retail, right? And that's the price we pay to a roaster, the retail price. Roasters, they're a consumer-facing party, right? They are kind of the educators, the tastemakers. They kind of develop their coffee culture goes within their communities, right? The retail price obviously needs to give the roaster their profit and operate roasters' business expenses. And then it also has built into it farm gate, FOB, and Ex Works if they bought it from an importer. So, you guys consider importing coffee to Australia? You know, I don't know if we've ever had a Chinese coffee at Cafe Imports. We've recently purchased in like Vietnam. I have personally been to China and had Chinese coffee and met some Chinese farmers, and I've had some good coffee from there. But you know, we've never found a connection in China with like enough coffee to buy. But we are always open to samples. You can always send samples to our Australia office. We have an Australia Cafe Imports office, and we sample everything we get. So going through the flow chart here, a producer may sell their coffee to a cooperative, they may sell their coffee to an exporter, or directly to an importer or roaster, right? And they might be selling their coffee in cherry or in parchment to a cooperative or exporter. If they're selling to a importer or a roaster directly, the producer and the importer party will license out somebody to mill that coffee, right? They'll work with an exporter and get that exporter under contract to help move that coffee. But they would not be considered, the person selling the importer the coffee, right? If that money gets wired directly to a producer, that is more of a direct purchase, what I guess we refer to as direct in the industry, right? So wherever that money is getting wired, that kind of defines what kind of purchase it is. Cooperatives, they sell to importers or roasters, and exporters. sell to importers or roasters. Roasters have the whole world of options, right? They can buy from any of the parties preceding them. Importers sell to roasters, roasters sell to consumers. Pretty straightforward, but when we talk about traceability, right? A roaster buying coffee from an importer, they may or may not know the FOB and the farm gate price, right? The roaster may or may not know. An importer buying from an exporter, they know the FOB, but depending on the exporter and the amount of information that exporter gathers, they may not know farm gate, right? Similarly with cooperative. With cooperative, you get a little bit closer. Usually cooperatives have more documentation of what they pay to producers, so you might know farm gate, but then working with a producer, you definitely know the farm gate price, right? So the deeper and deeper roasters and importers source, usually the higher clarity they have into who is getting paid what, right? So retail, X Works, free on board, farm gate. So now we kind of get into how prices are set and transparency. It all starts with the C market, right? Specialty coffee, we refer to it as differentiated, right? The differential is the gap between what we paid for a coffee and what the C market price was at the time, right? So in 2024, the average C price was $2.35 a pound. And this is just an example of like 80 to 83 point coffee might be 20 cents over C price. 84 to 85 might be $3, so 45 cents, 65 cents over C price. This 86 range, you start to get $4.50, right? Multiple dollars over the C price. And then 90 point plus, sky is the limit. You might have just heard that the Best of Panama coffee sold for almost $500,000, like a lot of coffee. I can't remember how much that broke to per pound, but an insane number, right? $500,000 for a lot of coffee. And so specialty coffee at the low end, the C market will impact the price. Yeah, there you go. Insane. You know, if a producer is delivering their coffee to, let's say, a large then that co-op typically posts every day, like, hey, if you deliver cherry today, this is what you will be paid per pound or per quintal or per whatever unit of measurement, right? And that price fluctuates with the C market when we're talking about kind of that 83 point, 84 point coffee. But as the coffee gets higher in quality, that C market becomes a little more subconscious in terms of how it impacts price, right? So that's a cup quality differential. We also pay premiums for social programs, right? We have a woman producer program, coca substitution program, programs for conservation of land, those kinds of things, right? So premiums might get paid for that. And then coffees that are certified are also paid, right? All of this contributes to the differential or the amount paid above the C market price. But again, remembering that the C market is 90 to 95% of coffee, right? And highly fluctuating. And specialty coffee is that top 5 to 10%. Again, 80 point coffee, heavily impacted, less so, and barely impacted, way up there, right? So typically, like when we're working with an exporter, the exporter might say, 83 point coffees, this is the differential we are asking for those coffees, right? All 86 points, they're getting more differential over the C market price. And then micro lots are not necessarily a differential, but rather we are just saying this coffee is 60 a pound, right? And so that's where, like, when we are buying from all the way from producers to co-ops or exporters, there are usually kind of agreed upon premiums based on the score of the coffee and then extra premiums for any social programs, if that makes sense. I'm not sure. Let's skip through these and kind of get here some transparency stuff. So the coffee buying timeline, how we actually go about buying coffee at Cafe Imports. Let's say the cooperative. That cooperative has a mill, right? They are basically storing all of their coffee. They are pulling samples from that coffee, and they are green grading those samples, roasting them, cupping them themselves, and then sending us samples, right? So we're receiving the sample called an offer. We will cup the offer, and then we'll say we want to buy it, right? A contract will be drafted and signed, saying that we intend to buy that coffee. The coffee will then be milled, right? So the coffee will go through its milling, it'll be sorted and then bagged into its jute bags. A sample will be pulled from that milled coffee, sent to us, called a pre-ship sample, and we approve that sample. Once that sample is approved, then we book all of the routing for the coffee, right? So trucking the coffee to port, getting that coffee out, getting that coffee to its importing port, and then we will handle trucking the coffee to our warehouse, right? But after we approve the PSS, the pre-ship sample, we make that booking. The coffee is then loaded onto a truck, delivered to port. Ownership transfers to us once that coffee's on the boat and the boat departs. The invoice for the coffee and shipping documents are then sent to us by the exporter, and we turn around and pay that invoice off, right? So that is called a cash against document system. Sometimes banks can be involved, where basically, the documents and invoice are sent to a bank. The bank holds it. We send the money to our bank, and the bank, and everything gets disseminated back to the buyer and seller. But this is typically how we buy coffee. We don't really ever have banks involved. We work with people that we trust, right? We're not worried about somebody running off with product or running off with money. Cool. So what is transparency? We've had some talks about transparency already, but transparency is the gathering and sharing of information, right? To better understand our impact of our business decisions, right? When we think about transparency in coffee, we often think about like, how much is every party getting? And is it a fair price? Well, fair price based on what, right? There are many ways to measure impact, right? We can say we're paying a producer well, that would be financial impact. But there's also, we try and measure our social impact and environmental impact, right? For Cafe Imports, we want to know that we are paying farmers well, we are paying our employees well, that we are making social impact, right? And that we are also being aware of like how much stress we're putting on the environment, right? There's a lot of ways to measure impact with transparency. There's a lot of ways we can measure it that we often don't even think about. But as we've grown in specialty coffee, and as we've grown as a business, we are trying to implement more detailed transparency. And it's important to do our best to measure impact, right? Without basically doxing everybody along the supply chain, right? So the big point here is like, oftentimes as roasters, our customers want to know how much did the farmer make, right? As we've seen today, there are a lot of hands that coffee goes through, and the roaster doesn't always know farm gate price. The roaster doesn't always know FOB price, right? Depending on how they bought that coffee. If a roaster buys a coffee from a farmer, they know the farm gate. In that situation, maybe the roaster can tell the customer what they paid for that coffee, right? And how much of that payment actually went to the producer. But in many situations, like Ethiopia, where all coffee goes through an exporter, basically, nobody really knows what the farm gate price is. That's not documented. So for a customer buying a really nice Ethiopia, sometimes there's friction there of like, wow, I'm paying 20 to 25 USD for this bag of coffee, but you guys don't even know how much you paid the farmer. There can be some friction there, right? And that's why, explaining how financial transparency doesn't fully paint the whole picture is kind of tough, right? Because consumers want to know. And so, I think with rampant production of product in the world, we've also received the means to kind of see the effect of that production. So consumers and even roasters and importers, we want to know that our purchases are having positive impacts, right? And like I've said already in this class, is that can be challenging and because producers will be underserved in coffee. So coffee has this weird situation where consumer back, there's more pressure being applied to producers to collect data, right? Like, how much are you paying your employees? How are you growing? How much to grow that coffee this year? What did you paid for all of the coffee here? What are the breakdown of the price per lot, right? You can get to see how asking a producer to provide all that information, it's an unequal position of power, right? Some producers are very excited to share that information, and that's great. And some other producers do not want to share that information for a number of reasons, right? Just like importers or roasters may or may not share a bunch of information, but finding ways to share information about the supply chain and our impact is really important. And it's, there's a lot of different ways this can happen, like third-party verification, things like B Corp, or I know there's some other businesses out there that are doing third-party verification of people's practices. This is a chart where basically every country we purchased in, we tried to do research and figure out what was the average specialty price premium above the C market. And then we evaluated our prices and adjusted them based on that, right? Trying to pay above the average specialty price. This is a good way to display information without, divulging too much private data. Ultimately, coffee needs to better understand the cost of production by region, right? That would be the next best model, is like, if we know the cost of production by region, then we can accurately try and place our premiums paid in that context, right? We can look at the living income in specific geographic areas. That's what coffee kind of needs. But ultimately, we're not always paying the producer directly, right? So the big thing for us when it comes to transparency is we are often pressured to try and provide as much data as possible. In some cases, we don't know everything about that coffee and where it came from. And the goal of transparency is to achieve more accountability, right? Our biggest thing is we're not trying to basically audit our partners, but rather we're trying to understand who our exporters we work with, who they are, what their goals are, what they're trying to do in their communities, and finding people who align with our values, right? Going back to specialty coffee, that's often what it's about, finding people who align with your values, and trusting that this is a fair exchange and that they are treating the people they work with behind them